Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another edition of Native Bidaské. I'm Levi Rickert, publisher and editor of Native News Online. This week we have a very special guest with us who has written a book about the long relationship between Native Americans and our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The author is scholar Dr. Elizabeth Ruhl, who teaches at American University, and I'll let her tell you what she teaches here in a minute, but she's a tribal citizen of Chickasaw Nation. That's important. The book is entitled Indigenous DC and Native American Peoples in the Nation's Capital. It was published last month by Georgetown University Press. Welcome, Elizabeth. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Levi. Thanks so much for having me on. It's wonderful to get an opportunity to talk with you and everyone who's listening about this new project.
Yes, and tell us, Elizabeth, first of all, what you teach at American University, and then I would like you to tell us what really attracted you, what made you think this is a good basis for a book, the relationship between Native Americans and our nation's capital.
Sure. Well, first things first, I live and work here in Washington, D.C. As you mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of critical race, gender, and culture studies at American University. And all of my scholarship and teaching there really focuses around Native American and Indigenous studies. And so this is my first book. And what brought me to the topic was actually moving to DC myself several years ago. Of course, I'm Native, but I'm not native to Washington, D.C. And so when I came to the nation's capital, originally I was actually interning here and working for my tribe. And then I moved here full time. And when I did that, over time, I naturally got to know the really beautiful, diverse, rich, Indigenous urban population here, and also, of course, more about the Indigenous history of Washington, D.C. as well. I also really had the pleasure of working with several Native American cohorts of students through the Native American Political Leadership Program. And I wanted to really have a resource available to our Native youth, our tribal leaders, our Native people who come here to represent their home communities on a federal level. I wanted to have a resource that talked about why Washington, D.C. is at the center of so many things we do as Indigenous peoples.
Yes, and tell us what current tribe or tribes, plural, because I think there's really more than one, in the area, and that it actually would probably extend up to Baltimore, which is 30 miles away or thereabouts. But give us a feel for what Native tribes are real present even today.
Sure. So Washington, D.C. is the traditional ancestral homelands of the Piscataway that are organized into several different communities, as well as the historic Anacostan and Nacotchink communities. And it also has several ties to the Powhatan Confederacy and, of course, neighbors to the north, right, who came and traveled through these territories. We know that our communities were not stagnant, that we had really robust trade networks and affiliations and moved all across the East Coast. And so with that in mind, it's really important to me that we understand that Washington, D.C. is Indigenous land. And as our nation's capital, we can expand that idea to all of the country being tribal land. Whether or not there's a federally recognized tribe or a reservation there, all of this land is someone's traditional ancestral homeland. And even in urban areas all across the country as well, including Washington, D.C., we have very rich diasporas of Native people who come from all different communities and make their own community there in the city.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I know that Washington being the seat of power in the United States, both the president, White House, and Supreme Court are all located there. I remember the first time I went, not as a tourist, but asked to conduct Native American business, and that was like 1992. I'm an old guy, but I still remember thinking about how tribal leaders would come to Washington to negotiate, maybe treaty rights, treaties themselves, and give us a feel for how that happened, and because you can almost, did they come by horseback, train? I guess combination. Now we fly in, right? Tribal leaders are in and out of Washington all the time now. But talk about that and tell me, did you feel that sense of history as well?
Absolutely, Levi. And that's such a great point. And it was one of the main ideas that I wanted to get across to particularly my Native students at the time, who I was working with when I first started investigating and learning more and actually developing the first iteration of this project, which was a mobile application highlighting sites of Indigenous significance all across our nation's capital. But like today, where we have tribal leaders coming from all across the country to Washington, D.C., we also historically have had our tribal leaders travel, in some cases for weeks at a time, as part of political delegations representing their home communities and their tribal nations, and coming here specifically with the intention of meeting with federal government representatives. And so these delegations, in many cases, they would meet with the president, they would meet with members of Congress, they would meet with folks from the Department of the Interior and the officials who were overseeing the Indian Affairs Division. And all of that was with the intention of creating treaty rights, right? Negotiating treaty rights, hearing, right, the issues that were affecting tribal nations and their lands and their home communities, making sure those issues were represented and heard here at the highest seat of power in the country. And really, that chain of advocacy has gone unbroken for well over 100 years. And just like you mentioned, even today, we have those delegations. We have things like the National Congress of American Indians and the Embassy of Tribal Nations. We have embassy outposts for tribal nations here in Washington, D.C. And these are just some of the sites that I highlight in the book itself. I want people to know that Native people are contemporary as well as historical, but that we're also political, right? And that Washington, D.C., as our nation's capital, is an essential place where those political ongoings happen. And so I highlight, again, places like NCAI, as well as the Congressional Cemetery, where we have over 24 tribal delegates and their family members, buried there as their final resting place.
Yeah, that one actually surprised me. I guess I didn't realize, I did not know that history. So thank you for that. Another thing that I guess I was not aware of is that some tribes actually have ambassadors that are working in Washington, D.C. on behalf of their tribes. So, and I think your tribe, as a matter of fact, was it Chickasaw Nation has an ambassador. The governor appointed that. So can you speak to that?
Yep, you're exactly right. So a small handful of tribal nations, such as the Chickasaw Nation, Navajo Nation has an office here in Washington, D.C. And again, the idea is that they need, that permanent presence. They need someone on the ground who is able to do that political work, really as an intermediary, right? Fulfilling all of the roles that an ambassador or a diplomat would between their tribal nations and the federal United States government. And that's really a function of tribal sovereignty. And so along with that, then we have Washington, D.C. exists as, the headquarters of so many national Native serving nonprofit organizations. Of course, we also have government offices like the Department of the Interior, which I talk about quite a bit in the book. Mm-hmm. And it's very exciting, of course, to see that relatively newly, we have Deb Haaland as the first Native person to be Secretary of the Interior. And that's, historic and monumental. And so in all of these ways, again, we see Washington, D.C. not only historically as an Indigenous place, but continue to evolve as a place where Native people are making our own history, where we're developing our communities and our professional networks here, and really coming here to get the things done that we need for our home communities.
Yeah, that is so significant because, and to our viewers who are not Native, because we do have a lot of viewers who are not Native, that tribal sovereignty is such a big deal. And I love how you describe that, Elizabeth, how the interaction of tribal leaders as diplomats working on behalf of tribes, and especially now with funding the way it is, and especially this administration is much more favorable, almost unprecedented dollars amounts that have been allocated, appropriated for tribes. And there's a lot of negotiation that has to take place between the departments once those dollars are allocated, appropriated, and it takes some real skilled negotiation sometimes just to be able to implement and put forth government contracts with the federal government. It's a very, very, very awesome responsibility that tribal leaders have. And the good news is we have some powerful tribal leaders that are there representing us, going to Washington back and forth. And there's one guy I know out of Washington State actually has an apartment there because he has so much business all the time. And I don't believe his tribe has a tribal office, but you mentioned Navajo Nation does. And I believe the Cherokee, Eastern Band of Cherokee has one as well by Capitol Hill. So, you know, what I do like, and you mentioned NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians, I really liked in this book, and one more time, folks, is Indigenous DC. Gives some really good history as to even the history of the National Congress of American Indians. I was really struck by that, and I really like, the history of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, how it was started in the Department of War, right? And so I kudos to you, Elizabeth. You did a great job. It was like it's a great history book, not just about. Well, you think it's, tell me why natives are important in Washington, but it gives such a great in-depth. So I'm praising you for that, but that was really great. One thing I will ask you, though, about, and it has to do with, and I've actually through the years have interviewed some of the American Indian movements who actually took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in November of 1972, just before the election, the presidential election. Richard Nixon was in the White House. But you know what? A point here I did not know, and I almost laughed about it when I read it, was the fact that the teepee that they erected, the American Indian movement erected, it was called the Tribal Nations Embassy, if I remember in the book, but it was borrowed from the Smithsonian Institution. I mean, how'd you find that fact out? That was quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, broadly, I can talk a little bit about the research process,
Okay. Yes.
And the organization of the book as a whole. So the chapters are organized thematically. And so we have a chapter, for example, about Indigenous arts in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. We have a chapter about Indigenous activism in our nation's capital. We have a chapter on delegations and monuments, memorials, and so on. And so each of the chapters then include various sites. And so for our readers, that's what you're really going to encounter is, how have Native people shaped not only the political history here, the artistic history here, but how have they also shaped the built and natural environments all around us? Where can you walk through Washington, D.C., like millions of tourists do every year, and see Indigenous influence or the result of Indigenous action actually on view? And so, yeah, some of the tidbits that I found were things that I learned as well. This was a process of going through archival materials, going through newspapers, historical newspapers, working with images from the Library of Congress, and also talking with people right locally who experience some of these things themselves. And so, even in your question, you're bringing up the National Museum of the American Indian, which is one of those sites that's discussed as well. And one of the things that's so interesting, like you point out, right, is that all of these sites ultimately are very deeply connected to one another. So even something like, the activist takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1972 has this connection then to, the Smithsonian that later would open the National Museum of the American
It's
Indian.
almost ironic, actually. Yeah.
Sure, right, exactly. And so I also wanted to bring forth this idea and this philosophy that we have, I think, across Native communities that, we don't exist and our history doesn't exist and our lands don't exist as just siloed and separate, right? They're all very interconnected. And that's a theme that you'll see throughout the book.
Yeah, it's a great book. I actually, if you go to now where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is located within the Department of Interior, and well, you get in that building is so mammoth. It's like you're walking a city block just to get to one. And Indian Affairs is kind of scattered in that building a little bit. And I was told by somebody, I will not reveal who that was, but they said never again will we have a position, one place where Native Americans just go in and just take it over, and that was done by design after the takeover in 1972. And Dennis Banks actually told me, he has the late Dennis Banks, who was a co-founder of American Indian Movement, told me that they really didn't intend to take that building over the day they walked in it, and it just happened. Things unfolded, and it lasted about 6 days, as I recall. So. And I was shocked when I read in the book, what was it, $2.87 million worth of damage or something along that line. That was pretty significant. And you referenced not since 1812 had there been that kind of destruction in Washington, D.C. So it was a phenomenal piece of tidbit of history.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that's really my intention, is to bring forth for people who have no awareness, right? Because there are many people, I'm sure folks who are listening now who have never heard about this activist moment, who've never heard about things like the Trail of Broken Treaties. But even for people who had, right, I wanted to talk about maybe what are some interesting facts that people would be less aware of. That's just interesting to know. And I think it's so often the case when it comes to any Indigenous subject material that there's overwhelmingly just a lack of awareness. And so the book is really designed to be accessible to people who are Native themselves, right? Or who do study Indigenous topics, who work in this field. Perhaps you'll learn something new about Washington, D.C., but also to people who've never read a book about Native peoples, even somebody who's maybe even never met a Native person. I hope that they can pick up the book as well and learn about our nation's capital and how American history is Native American history, how Washington, D.C. Is not only the capital of the United States, but like I'm arguing in the book as well, also the political capital of Indian country.
I love that. And one more time, kudos for the historic value you bring to the book, because those who, it's not just about, okay, Washington, D.C., and there's some relationship between natives. You can really get some really good history. You did a great job. Hey, I was at the march on March 10th, I believe it was, 2017. It was the Standing Rock. And there were, and you wrote in the book, 18 minutes from one, get past a certain point. It took 18 minutes. There's thousands and thousands. And I think I've heard as high as 10,000. And I don't recall you writing that in the book, but you gave a nice account of that. Were you there? Were you there that day, or you just wrote about it?
I was not there that day. So in that case, I relied on some of the video footage.
Okay.
It was actually really interesting that, 18-minute segment. I even watched some of that online, right? What were the passers-by viewing?
Yes.
And actually gathering some information that way as well.
Yeah, and I was, and you note in the book when the marcher stopped in front of the Trump Hotel, and he had only been president for, as I recall, it was March, so it would have been less than 2 months. But they were there. They got on top of his bus. They erected a teepee. I don't think it was from the Smithsonian, but they brought their own this time. But it was quite the day. And then as I read through the account of the various speakers, I'm thinking, I was there. So I was excited, and I'm not a historian per se, but I love history, and so you capture that one as well. And I'm telling this book, folks, Indigenous DC, you need to get it because you get some really good. It's just historic and even contemporary Native American. Because Standing Rock, although these years go by really quickly, it's already been it was 2016, 2017, so 6 years. So yeah, these years are going by quickly. But it was quite the day for us in Washington D.C. And Elizabeth, tell us. You mentioned the art, and I just like that part of it too. Tell us how art is scattered around various places in Washington, D.C., including the Oval Office now, technically. But go ahead.
Sure. And even before I get there, I want to say one thing too about some of the activism. It's so often the case that when we hear about these activist moments, we just think about the march or we just think about the rally. And of course, Washington, D.C. is famous for this type of political mobilization as well. But again, I wanted to give some insight when talking about the activist moments into the fact that there was months of preparation in advance, right? And then after the march as well, months of debriefing. And in addition to some of those rallies, right, there's also the erection of, the camps on the National Mall. And, it's a multiple day combination of lobbying and political meeting and talks and cultural events and just community making, as well as the events that really get the spotlight shown on them. But once again, those Indigenous artworks as well connect to the Indigenous activism, of course. And there are several really incredible pieces of Indigenous artwork all across Washington, D.C. One of my really personal favorites is The Spirit of Haida Gwaii, which is considered Bill Reed's masterpiece work. Bill Reed was an internationally acclaimed Haida artist based out of Canada. And The Spirit of Haida Gwaii is just this, monumental, larger than life sculpture that sits outside of the Canadian Embassy. Oh, yes. And in addition to being just strikingly beautiful and moving to look at, that was a really interesting piece for me to interact with as a researcher, because when I first learned about that piece, it was actually in Vancouver. I was traveling there for work. I was in the Vancouver International Airport, and I saw the counterpoint to that sculpture. And I'm reading about it. I'm taking pictures of it because it's just beautiful. And I learned later that there's actually the same sculpture, just cast in a different color, right here in Washington, D.C. Wow. At the time, it was less than a mile away from where I was living. And to me, that just illuminated the issue, which is that the Native American arts in Washington, D.C. don't get the recognition, and people just don't necessarily know where these pieces are. And so I wanted to use the book also to give visibility to these incredible artworks. And, it's not only that Native stories are untold. Sometimes they are told, like this piece. It's out there, but we just don't always highlight it. And so people don't have the opportunity to engage with it. And so The Spirit of Haida Gwaii, again, is both beautiful and also very meaningful to me personally through my own journey in preparing this book.
Yeah, that's a great point, because you probably went by it countless times and just were completely unaware. And, sure. and a lot of times in life, and it's to our viewers, it's just about paying attention. And that's what's great about this book, is paying attention to what was there. And she has connected the dots so well. And I mean, a lot of people don't even realize that Ira Hayes is part of that statue at Iwo Jima by the Pentagon. And so, that's in your app. I remember that because I was at a conference and they were touting your app one time with some Native youth, and could have been at the Center for Native American Youth up at the Aspen or someplace. I know someplace in Washington they were touting your app, and before I even met you, so this is kind of cool. You were able to connect the dots on that as well. Hey, what else do you want us to learn about the book and before we sign off?
Yeah, one of the things that I want people to really take away from the book as well, is that I want us to think about an Indigenous future, right? I want us to, of course, grapple with the fact that Native people aren't only historical, we're also contemporary, but also that Washington, D.C., and again, all of this land and all of our communities, we're going to move into the future as well, right? And, many of our communities talk about thinking into the future and about our future generations. And I just see that so clearly happening here in Washington, D.C., too. It's not only that Washington, D.C. is Native land and that it has always been Native land, but also that Native people are always going to have a place here, right? We're always going to make this space our own. We're always going to come here. We're always going to fight for our needs, for our communities. And in that way, too, I just want to give that uplifting message to anyone who's thinking about coming here, who's thinking about doing advocacy work, students who are thinking about coming here for school or for an internship. I want you all to know, right? All of the listeners that DC has a really fantastic community here, network here of people who move throughout this city. And, I just want to encourage that because I think it's deeply connected again to the work of uplifting our communities by staying involved in that way.
Well, Elizabeth Rule, thank you so much. And again, folks, Indigenous DC, Native Peoples in the Nation's Capital is an excellent book, and Native News Online is endorsing it. So congratulations, Elizabeth, and we hope to have you back on Native Bidaské again at some point.
Thank you so much, Levi. It's been a real pleasure.
And to our viewers, next week we'll have another edition of Native Bidaské. In the meantime, be safe, take care of your families, enjoy the graduation ceremonies around. It's time to celebrate Native American graduates. Thank you very much. Chi Miigwech.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chi Miigwech.